The Yom Kippur War opened in October 1973 with Israel doing the one thing its entire security system was designed to prevent: losing control in the first 48 hours. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal. Syrian armor pressed the Golan Heights. The Israeli Air Force, the symbol of 1967's certainty, suddenly looked constrained by missiles, by time, by assumptions. The shock was not that Israel was attacked. The shock was that Israel had built an entire doctrine around the belief that it would never be surprised again. So why did the warning system hesitate when the signals were there? Why did decision-makers treat mobilization like a political risk instead of a military necessity? And why did Arab strategy stop trying to win the war and focus instead on breaking Israel's idea of inevitability? This episode is not about who fired first or which unit moved where. It is about a system that learned the wrong lesson from victory. After 1967, Israel did not just gain territory. It gained a kind of strategic confidence that can feel rational inside a command room. When a doctrine works once, fast, decisive, overwhelming, it stops being a plan. It becomes a worldview. And worldviews do not like interruptions. In October 1973, the interruption arrived in the worst possible form: simultaneous pressure, limited time, and a mobilization-dependent military caught in the narrow gap between "we should act" and "we can't justify acting yet." That gap is the real battlefield. The core strategic problem in this documentary is simple to state and brutal to explain. How does a state built on early warning end up paralyzed by its own warning system? Because the most dangerous surprise is not the enemy's move. It is the moment your own institution decides that surprise is impossible. The Yom Kippur War is unorthodox not because Israel made one incorrect call. It is unorthodox because the incorrect call had been engineered into the structure. A set of assumptions about enemy capability, enemy intent, and what counts as a credible threat became so dominant that they filtered reality before it reached action. And on the other side, Egypt and Syria did something equally unorthodox. They did not need a clean battlefield victory. They needed a strategic effect. They needed to prove that Israel could be hurt. They needed to force Israel into improvisation. They needed to tear down the psychological architecture of deterrence that had formed after 1967. That is the first twist most people miss. The goal was not conquest in the classic sense. The goal was collapse of certainty. This is why the first 48 hours matter more than the war's endpoint. In those hours, the Israeli system was tested under maximum compression. Not just commanders and crews. The entire national logic, the belief that warnings would be clear, that mobilization could be timed, that air power could buy time, that the enemy would not take actions that looked suicidal. When those beliefs collided with a different kind of Arab strategy, one that accepted risk, accepted losses, and accepted ambiguity, the Israeli response did not fail because of cowardice or incompetence. It failed because the system had trained itself to recognize only one kind of war. The documentary will dissect this failure without romanticism and without easy villains. We will follow the chain that begins with success, hardens into doctrine, and ends as blindness. We will also follow the opposite chain: how an opponent, denied the ability to win in Israel's terms, rewrites the terms of victory. And then we will confront the cost. Not the abstract cost. The human cost created when mobilization is delayed, when assumptions are protected, and when the first hours are paid for in lives that doctrine promised to save. Because the most unsettling conclusion is not that Israel was surprised. It is that Israel's confidence was not an emotion. It was an operating system. And once an operating system rejects reality, it does not crash politely. It crashes on the front line. And to understand why those first 48 hours unfolded the way they did, we have to start with the map, not the geography, but the strategic trap both sides were building before the first shot was fired. This war did not begin with movement on the ground. It began with a balance that looked stable only if you accepted Israel's assumptions as permanent truths. On paper, Israel faced two adversaries, Egypt to the south and Syria to the north, separated by distance, doctrine, and political mistrust. Israel's central belief was that this separation made coordination unlikely, escalation predictable, and warning unavoidable. That belief shaped everything: force posture, mobilization timing, intelligence thresholds, even political risk tolerance. The map Israel was reading was not physical terrain. It was a mental diagram of what the enemy could not do. Israel's real objective before the war was not deterrence alone. It was control over tempo. As a small state dependent on reserves, Israel required time more than space. Time to mobilize. Time to deploy air power freely. Time to concentrate forces and decide where to absorb pressure and where to counterstrike. Every strategic decision after 1967 was optimized to preserve that time. Early warning was not a tool. It was the foundation. Lose warning, and the entire system would be forced into emergency improvisation. Egypt and Syria understood this structure better than Israel realized. They did not need to defeat Israel's forces outright. They needed to compress time. They needed to attack in a way that forced Israel to choose between premature mobilization and delayed reaction. Both options carried strategic penalties. Mobilize too early, and Israel risked political isolation and economic strain. Mobilize too late, and the battlefield would fill with consequences that no airstrike could erase. This is where the strategic situation becomes unorthodox. Egypt's leadership accepted a form of limited ambition that ran against decades of Arab military thinking. The goal was not deep penetration or annihilation of Israeli forces. It was to cross the Suez Canal, establish a defensible presence, and survive. Survival itself would be victory, because it would shatter the assumption that Israel could always dictate the terms of engagement. Syria, operating under different constraints, aimed for shock and pressure in the north, not decisive conquest. Together, the two fronts created a strategic pincer not designed to crush, but to destabilize. Israel's constraints made this pincer lethal. Geography forced Israel to fight near its borders. Politics limited preemptive action. Mobilization required visible signals that could not be hidden from allies or adversaries. The Air Force, once the guarantor of delay and dominance, now faced surface-to-air missile systems that restricted freedom of movement and raised the cost of early intervention. These were not tactical inconveniences. They were structural pressures pushing Israel toward hesitation. The most dangerous constraint was psychological. After 1967, Israeli leadership internalized the idea that deterrence had altered enemy behavior permanently. War was no longer expected unless conditions resembled those of the past. Any deviation from that template was treated as noise, not signal. Exercises could be explained away. Deployments could be interpreted as defensive posturing. Political rhetoric could be dismissed as domestic theater. The enemy, in Israeli planning, remained frozen in an older version of itself. Meanwhile, the Arab coalition operated under a different logic. They assumed Israel would see the build-up. They assumed Israel would hesitate. And they assumed that hesitation would be enough. This was a strategy built not on secrecy, but on credibility. The moves were visible because they needed to look plausible without looking decisive. The line between preparation and provocation was deliberately blurred. Time, again, was the weapon. Every day Israel delayed full mobilization preserved Arab initiative. Every hour compressed Israel's margin for error. And because Israel's system was designed to avoid false alarms more than missed alarms, it required overwhelming confirmation to act. The threshold for certainty was set too high for a war designed to live below it. On the battlefield, this translated into fragile initial deployments. Thin lines, limited reserves, reliance on rapid reinforcement that assumed warning would arrive before contact. When contact came first, Doctrine had no immediate answer. Units fought bravely, but bravery does not replace readiness. Air power struck, but not with the freedom it once enjoyed. Commanders reacted, but within a framework that had already lost its central advantage. The strategic map, then, was asymmetric in a way most analyses overlook. Israel believed it controlled escalation. Egypt and Syria believed they controlled timing. Israel believed war would look like its last victory. The Arab coalition designed a war that looked survivable, deniable, and politically useful even if militarily incomplete. Each side was rational within its own model. Only one model accounted for failure. The deeper irony is that Israel's intelligence system was not blind. Signals existed. Indicators accumulated. But the system was not designed to ask whether the enemy had redefined success. It only asked whether the enemy was ready to attempt decisive victory. Because the answer appeared to be no, the warning remained incomplete. By the time the shooting began, the strategic geometry had already shifted. Israel was reacting inside a framework built for a different war. Egypt and Syria were operating inside a framework designed to exploit that mismatch. The opening hours were not chaos. They were the logical outcome of incompatible assumptions colliding under pressure. And this is the critical realization: the Yom Kippur War was not launched into a vacuum of ignorance. It was launched into a landscape of overconfidence, institutional rigidity, and misaligned incentives. The battlefield merely revealed what had already been decided in conference rooms and doctrine manuals years earlier. Because once you understand this strategic map, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the normal way of fighting guaranteed failure, what kind of decision could possibly replace it, and who would dare to make it? Every military system has a default answer. A set of responses so rehearsed, so internally consistent, that they feel less like choices and more like laws of physics. For Israel after 1967, that default answer was preemption enabled by early warning. Detect the buildup. Mobilize reserves. Achieve air superiority. Destroy enemy formations before they can impose tempo. End the war quickly, before geography and manpower turn into liabilities. This approach was not reckless. It was rational, elegant, and proven. That was precisely the problem. If we place a conventional commander into Israel's position in 1973, the playbook appears obvious. Intelligence detects large-scale enemy movements. The Air Force strikes first, degrading command centers and armored concentrations. Reserves are mobilized decisively, even at political cost. The war is fought on enemy terms only briefly, before being flipped back into Israel's preferred tempo. In theory, this method minimizes casualties, preserves deterrence, and shortens conflict. In theory, it is the responsible choice. But doctrine does not exist in isolation. It exists inside constraints. And by 1973, every pillar that made this doctrine reliable had been weakened, without being formally discarded. Early warning was no longer binary. It was probabilistic, noisy, and politically charged. Mobilization was no longer a purely military act. It carried diplomatic consequences, economic disruption, and the risk of being blamed for escalation. Air superiority was no longer guaranteed. Surface-to-air missile systems imposed costs that doctrine had not fully integrated. And perhaps most critically, the enemy no longer needed to be defeated in the way doctrine assumed. The normal way of fighting required Israel to believe three things at once. First, that warning would be unmistakable. Second, that preemption would be politically survivable. Third, that the enemy was still pursuing decisive victory rather than limited strategic effect. If any one of these assumptions failed, doctrine became fragile. By October 1973, all three were failing simultaneously. This is the contradiction at the heart of the Yom Kippur War. The textbook solution demanded clarity, but the strategic environment produced ambiguity. The doctrine demanded initiative, but the political context punished it. The doctrine assumed an enemy-chasing battlefield success, while the enemy had shifted to psychological and political disruption. Following the playbook was no longer safe. But abandoning it felt irresponsible. This is why the doctrine did not simply fail. It trapped decision-makers in a narrowing corridor of acceptable action. Mobilize too early, and Israel risks appearing as the aggressor, fracturing external support and exhausting its reserve-based economy. Mobilize too late, and the battlefield fills with consequences that no amount of professionalism can undo. The doctrine offered no answer for partial mobilization, delayed certainty, or limited enemy objectives. It was optimized for a war that either had not yet begun, or had already been won. A conventional commander would also trust the internal logic of deterrence. After repeated defeats, rational enemies adapt by avoiding confrontation they cannot win. This belief is taught, reinforced, and rewarded. Yet Egypt and Syria were not attempting to win in Israel's terms. They were attempting to make Israel fight outside its comfort zone. From the perspective of Israeli doctrine, this behavior looked irrational. From the perspective of Egyptian and Syrian leadership, it was the only rational option left. Here lies the most dangerous lesson doctrine failed to teach, that enemies do not need to share your definition of success. Military education emphasizes capability and intent, but often treats strategic imagination as secondary. In 1973, Israeli assessments were strong on capability and rigid on intent. Analysts could measure divisions, aircraft, and logistics. What they could not easily measure was the enemy's willingness to accept loss in exchange for narrative, leverage, and time. The doctrine also underestimated the cost of waiting once contact occurred. It assumed that even if warning failed, Israel's qualitative edge could stabilize the front until reserves arrived. This assumption ignored the compounding effects of surprise under modern conditions. Thin defensive lines are not just vulnerable, they are psychologically brittle. Commanders are forced into reactive posture. Air power is tasked defensively rather than decisively. Every hour without reserves magnifies losses and erodes confidence. Doctrine treated time as elastic. Reality treated it as a blade. Another blind spot was organizational. Doctrine is not just a set of ideas, it is embedded in training cycles, promotion incentives, and command culture. Officers who challenged the prevailing model did not appear prudent. They appeared alarmist. Those who adhered to it appeared disciplined and professional. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where caution is redefined as restraint, and doubt is redefined as disloyalty to hard-earned success. By the time doctrine becomes questionable, it is already socially expensive to question it. The normal approach also assumed a linear escalation ladder. Warning leads to mobilization. Mobilization leads to deterrence or war. War leads to decisive action. But Egypt and Syria deliberately scrambled this ladder. They mobilized without triggering full-scale Israeli response. They prepared without crossing Israel's threshold for action. They initiated combat under conditions that made preemption impossible by definition. The doctrine had no mechanism for dealing with a war that began below the level it was designed to prevent. What emerges from this analysis is not a story of incompetence, but of mismatch. The doctrine was coherent. The commanders were experienced. The intelligence was active. But the environment had changed in ways that doctrine did not recognize as existential. The result was paralysis disguised as caution, and caution mistaken for control. This is why the Yom Kippur War cannot be understood as a failure to follow the rules. It was a failure caused by following them too faithfully, for too long, in a context that no longer rewarded obedience. The most unorthodox element of this war is not the attack itself. It is the realization that sometimes, the safest doctrine is the most dangerous thing you can trust. And once doctrine stops offering protection, the next question becomes unavoidable. How does a system even begin to imagine a different kind of decision, and who inside that system is willing to risk being wrong? The most dangerous decisions are rarely dramatic. They do not arrive as bold declarations or desperate gambles. They form quietly, inside rooms where everyone believes they are being cautious. The unorthodox decision at the heart of the Yom Kippur War was not a single order. It was the collective choice not to act, made repeatedly, by different actors, each convinced they were protecting the system from unnecessary risk. No one sat down and decided to lose the first 48 hours. What emerged instead was a consensus built from restraint, precedent, and fear of being wrong in the wrong way. Within Israel's leadership, there was no absence of debate. There were warnings, dissenting assessments, and uncomfortable signals that did not fit cleanly into the established framework. But the structure of decision-making ensured that these signals competed against something far more powerful than evidence, credibility earned through past success. The individuals most confident in the existing doctrine were also those whose judgment had been validated by 1967. Their authority was not imposed. It was inherited from victory. The internal argument was not between action and inaction. It was between two types of risk. One side feared mobilizing too early, triggering international backlash, economic disruption, and the accusation of provoking war. The other feared mobilizing too late, entering combat under unfavorable conditions. Both sides understood the stakes. What separated them was not intelligence, but tolerance for uncertainty. And in that environment, certainty, however artificial, was rewarded. The core unorthodox choice was this: Israel chose to treat mobilization as a political liability rather than a military insurance policy. This inverted a foundational principle of its own security logic. For a reserve-based force, early mobilization is not escalation. It is survival. Yet in 1973, mobilization was reframed as a move that required near-perfect justification. The burden of proof shifted from "why not mobilize" to "why mobilize at all?" This shift did not happen overnight. It evolved from years of relative quiet, where false alarms carried reputational costs and restraint was interpreted as strategic maturity. Each time the system hesitated and nothing happened, hesitation was reinforced. Over time, caution became competence. By the time the real test arrived, hesitation no longer felt like a decision. It felt like continuity. At the heart of this continuity were several critical assumptions. The first was that Egypt would not initiate war without a credible path to decisive success. This assumption was deeply embedded, because it aligned with classical military logic. Wars are fought to win, not to endure. Yet Egypt had quietly redefined success. Survival, symbolism, and political leverage were sufficient. Israel's leadership did not ignore this possibility. They discounted it as irrational. The second assumption was that Syria would not act without Egypt achieving clear momentum first. Coordination across fronts was seen as difficult, risky, and unlikely. This belief underestimated not Syrian capability, but Syrian desperation. It also ignored the possibility that limited success, even temporary, could be strategically meaningful. Israel planned for coordination at scale. The Arab coalition planned for coordination in timing. The third assumption was that even if warning failed, Israel's qualitative edge could stabilize the front long enough for reserves to arrive. This belief rested on past performance, not present conditions. It did not fully account for missile-dominated airspace, improved anti-armor capabilities, or the psychological effects of being attacked underprepared. The assumption was not foolish. It was outdated. What makes this decision unorthodox is not that Israel chose restraint. Restraint is often wise. What makes it unorthodox is that restraint was elevated into doctrine without recalibration. It became an automatic response rather than a situational judgment. In effect, Israel bet that its previous victories had permanently altered the enemy's behavior. That bet felt safe precisely because it had never been tested under these conditions. Inside the command structure, dissent faced a structural disadvantage. Those arguing for early mobilization could not offer certainty. They could only offer risk. Those arguing for delay could point to precedent, stability, and the absence of definitive proof. In bureaucratic systems, the argument that avoids visible disruption almost always wins. The cost of delay is abstract, until it is not. There was also a deeper psychological factor at play, the fear of being responsible for unnecessary war. Israeli leadership understood that mobilization itself could trigger conflict. To act and be wrong would carry moral and political weight. To wait and be wrong would carry operational cost, but responsibility would be diffuse, shared by the system. This asymmetry quietly favored delay. Meanwhile, the Arab strategy exploited this hesitation deliberately. Preparations were visible, but calibrated. Signals were strong enough to be noticed, but ambiguous enough to be dismissed. This was not deception in the classic sense. It was strategic pressure applied below the threshold of certainty. Israel was not tricked into blindness. It was guided into doubt. The unorthodox nature of the moment lies here. Israel did not fail to imagine the enemy's move. It failed to imagine that imagination itself had become the battlefield. The decision-making process assumed that clarity would precede danger. The enemy assumed danger would arrive wrapped in ambiguity. When the first shots were fired, no single individual could be blamed for the delay. That is precisely why the delay happened. The system had optimized itself to avoid catastrophic false positives, not catastrophic false negatives. It had been designed to prevent overreaction. It was not designed to absorb surprise at scale. This is the paradox of strategic success. The more consistently a doctrine works, the harder it becomes to abandon. The more authority it accumulates, the more dangerous dissent becomes. And when the environment changes quietly, the doctrine does not collapse. It holds, until it breaks. By the time Israel recognized that restraint itself had become the risk, the window for clean action was already closing. The decision had been made, not in a single meeting, but through repetition. Each hour of delay made reversal more costly. Each reaffirmation of caution narrowed the range of acceptable responses. This is how the unorthodox decision truly formed. Not as a leap into the unknown, but as a gradual commitment to a known past. And once committed, the system had no graceful way out. Because the moment this decision met reality, the question was no longer whether the assumptions were correct, but whether the system could survive the price of discovering they were not. A strategy does not fail the moment it is proven wrong. It fails when it is forced to operate outside the conditions it was built for. The first hours of the Yom Kippur War exposed exactly that kind of failure. Israel's strategic logic did not collapse instantly. It unraveled step by step, as assumptions met friction, and friction multiplied faster than the system could adapt. On paper, Israel's defensive posture relied on delay. Thin forward deployments were never meant to stop a full-scale assault. They were designed to buy time, time for warning, time for mobilization, time for air power to shape the battlefield before ground forces had to absorb pressure. Once that sequence broke, everything that followed became improvisation. Not because commanders lacked skill, but because the system no longer controlled tempo. When Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal, the crossing itself was not the greatest shock. The shock was how quickly the expected Israeli responses became constrained. Air power, long assumed to be the decisive compensator, encountered a dense missile environment that forced it into cautious, fragmented missions. Instead of dominating the battlefield, it was pulled into defensive tasks, protecting ground units and reacting to threats that Doctrine had assumed would be neutralized early. The Air Force was not defeated. It was restricted. And restriction, in a time-dependent system, is often enough. On the ground, the problem was not collapse, but exposure. Units fought in positions that had been optimized for deterrence, not sustained defense. Commanders were suddenly forced to choose between holding terrain that Doctrine said was temporary and withdrawing under fire without reserves to replace them. Every decision carried irreversible cost. Hold too long, and units risk encirclement. Withdraw too early, and morale fractures under the perception of retreat. Doctrine offered no clean answer, because Doctrine had assumed this phase would never be reached. Mobilization, once delayed, became chaotic rather than orderly. Reserves were called up under pressure, moving into a battlefield already shaped by enemy initiative. Equipment flowed, but not always to the right place at the right time. Coordination suffered, not because of incompetence, but because synchronization depends on preparation. When preparation is compressed, coordination turns into collision. The system did not break. It strained, and strain is where casualties concentrate. One of the most dangerous effects of delayed execution was psychological. Israeli commanders had been trained to fight with confidence in superiority and control. Now they were reacting, under uncertainty, against opponents who appeared willing to absorb losses without losing momentum. This inverted the emotional balance of the battlefield. The side that expected to stabilize quickly instead faced a rolling series of tactical crises. Each was manageable on its own. Together, they created the sense of a system slipping out of alignment. This is where the unorthodox nature of the enemy strategy became fully visible. Egypt and Syria were not exploiting gaps for decisive breakthroughs. They were exploiting time itself. Every hour Israel spent restoring order was an hour the Arab coalition achieved its strategic objective. They did not need to advance far. They needed Israel to bleed attention, confidence, and initiative. There were moments, critical moments, when the Israeli system nearly regained coherence. Counterattacks formed. Air strikes adapted. Command and control tightened. But each recovery came at a higher cost than Doctrine had planned for, because the margin for error had been consumed early. What should have been a controlled response became a sequence of high-risk corrections. The micro-twists of this phase are not cinematic accidents. They are structural consequences. Missile defenses that performed better than expected. Anti-armor systems that punished exposed formations. Communications delays that turned local reverses into perceived collapses. None of these elements were decisive alone. Together, they transformed execution into attrition under surprise. Perhaps the most telling aspect of this phase is how little room there was for strategic choice. Once the initial assumptions failed, Israel was forced into reaction mode. Every decision was shaped by what had already gone wrong. There was no clean reset, no pause to reframe objectives. The system had to fight its way back into a position where choice was possible again. This is the hidden cost of doctrinal rigidity. When doctrine fails early, it does not simply stop working. It continues to influence decisions even as reality contradicts it. Commanders still act as if stabilization is imminent, even when conditions say otherwise. That delay between perception and reality is where losses accumulate. The execution phase of the Yom Kippur War was not a story of chaos. It was a story of friction overwhelming design. Israel's forces adapted, often heroically, but adaptation under fire is always more expensive than preparation under clarity. The enemy understood this. That understanding shaped their timing, their objectives, and their willingness to endure losses without seeking immediate payoff. By the end of the initial phase, Israel was no longer fighting to prevent surprise. That battle had been lost. It was fighting to restore strategic agency, to reach a point where decisions were once again choices rather than reactions. The cost of reaching that point was paid in lives, equipment, and psychological shock. And this is the crucial realization: the first 48 hours did not nearly collapse Israel because the enemy was stronger. They nearly collapsed Israel because the system was forced to operate without the one resource it valued most: time. Once time was lost, every other advantage became conditional. And as Israel struggled to regain control, the final question emerged with brutal clarity: how did the enemy read these reactions, and where did they miscalculate the moment Israel would finally strike back? The most revealing phase of the Yom Kippur War begins after surprise succeeds. Not at the moment of attack, but at the moment when the attacker must decide how far to push. This is where unorthodox strategy faces its greatest test: interpreting the enemy's reaction correctly, in real time, under pressure. Egypt and Syria had designed a war to exploit Israeli hesitation. What they had not fully designed for was what Israel would do once hesitation ended. From the Arab perspective, the opening phase validated their core assumptions. Israeli mobilization was delayed. Air power was constrained. Defensive lines bent under pressure. Most importantly, Israel did not immediately regain strategic initiative. This reinforced the belief that the Israeli system had been fundamentally shaken, not temporarily disrupted. Early success began to reshape Arab decision-making, just as Israeli success in 1967 had reshaped Israeli doctrine. This is where the strategic danger emerged. The Arab coalition had planned for shock, not momentum. Their strategy was built around limited objectives that were psychologically decisive but operationally bounded. Once those objectives were achieved, continuation required a different kind of thinking, one that neither Egypt nor Syria had fully aligned on. Egyptian command, in particular, faced a dilemma created by its own success. The original concept prioritized holding territory east of the Suez Canal under the protection of surface-to-air missile coverage. This posture maximized survivability and political effect. Pushing beyond it risked exposure to Israeli counterattack. Yet the visible strain on Israeli forces created pressure, internal and external, to capitalize further. Victory, once achieved, began to demand expansion. Syria faced a different but related problem. Its initial gains created urgency rather than caution. The northern front was closer to Israel's population centers, and Israeli counteraction there was expected to be faster and more decisive. Syrian leadership interpreted Israeli delay as an opportunity window rather than a temporary disruption. This encouraged continued offensive pressure, even as logistical and command limitations accumulated. The critical misreading by both opponents was temporal. They interpreted Israeli reaction time as Israeli incapacity. In reality, Israel was not deciding whether to fight back. It was deciding when it could fight back coherently. This distinction matters. A system dependent on reserves does not respond immediately. It responds explosively once mobilization reaches critical mass. Arab command structures, meanwhile, suffered from their own rigidities. Coordination between fronts was politically aligned but operationally uneven. Decision-making was centralized, cautious, and sensitive to perceived shifts in momentum. Once Israeli countermeasures began to stabilize the front, the Arab coalition struggled to recalibrate its expectations. What had been designed as a limited war now faced the risk of escalation without a unified strategy for escalation. Another miscalculation lay in assumptions about Israeli tolerance for loss. Arab planners correctly assumed Israel was sensitive to casualties. What they underestimated was Israel's capacity to absorb early losses and then reorganize ruthlessly. The initial shock inflicted psychological damage, but it also removed internal hesitation. Once the price had already been paid, restraint no longer offered protection. The political cost of mobilization collapsed the moment war was undeniable. This is the strategic pivot point. The same Israeli system that hesitated under ambiguity became decisive under clarity. Command authority tightened. Objectives narrowed. Air power adapted. Ground forces concentrated. The enemy, having achieved its symbolic victory, now faced a form of Israeli response that Doctrine had always promised, just later, and with fewer constraints. From the Arab perspective, this shift was difficult to interpret in time. Success had created momentum bias. Early gains anchored expectations, making it harder to recognize when conditions were changing. Signals that Israel was regaining coherence were visible, but discounted. This mirrors Israel's earlier error. Both sides, at different moments, filtered reality through assumptions validated by short-term success. The deeper irony is that the Arab strategy worked precisely because it exploited Israeli rigidity, but then faltered when it encountered Israeli adaptability. The strategy was asymmetric in conception, but not fully asymmetric in execution. It relied on Israel remaining trapped in its own caution. Once that caution dissolved, the imbalance reversed. This phase reveals an uncomfortable truth about unorthodox warfare: exploiting an opponent's system is not enough. You must also anticipate how that system behaves once it breaks free from its constraints. Egypt and Syria planned for surprise. They did not fully plan for recovery. As Israeli counteroffensives gathered force, the limits of the Arab approach became clear. Logistics strained. Air defenses thinned. Command decisions slowed under fear of overextension. What had been a war of controlled pressure risked becoming a war of uncontrolled exposure. The very restraint that defined Arab strategy early now constrained it later. The Yom Kippur War therefore cannot be read as a simple arc of surprise followed by reversal. It is a study in misaligned expectations. Israel underestimated how much damage surprise could do. The Arab coalition underestimated how quickly Israel could reconstitute once surprise was spent. Both sides were right and wrong at different moments. The key lesson of this phase is not that one side reacted intelligently and the other foolishly. It is that strategic success alters perception faster than reality. Once momentum appears to shift, decision-making accelerates, often without sufficient recalibration of risk. The war's outcome was shaped not only by plans, but by how each side interpreted the other's response under pressure. And when the fighting stabilized, the final accounting could begin, not just of territory gained or lost, but of the price paid for betting entire systems on fragile assumptions. When the Yom Kippur War reached a point of operational stabilization, it became tempting to read the outcome backward. Israel eventually regained the initiative. Counteroffensives crossed lines that had seemed impossible days earlier. The immediate military balance no longer resembled the opening shock. But this temptation is misleading. Strategic outcomes are not measured only by where a war ends. They are measured by what a system is forced to spend in order to survive. Israel did not lose the war in the conventional sense. But it paid for the first 48 hours with a cost structure its doctrine had been designed to avoid. Casualties were concentrated early, when units fought underprepared and unsupported. Losses were not just numerical, they were psychological. Confidence in invulnerability collapsed abruptly, and once lost, it could not be restored by later success on the battlefield. The human cost was immediate and uneven. Forward units absorbed the consequences of delayed mobilization. Commanders and soldiers fought not as part of a synchronized system, but as fragments holding under pressure. Many of the dead were casualties of time rather than tactics, men placed in positions that doctrine assumed would never face full assault. This is the cruelest outcome of strategic miscalculation: losses incurred not because a plan failed in execution, but because the plan assumed execution would never be required. The logistical cost followed closely behind. Israel's reserve-based structure was stretched to its limit. Equipment flowed rapidly, but urgency replaced efficiency. Systems designed for orderly mobilization were forced into crisis mode. External resupply became critical, not as a contingency, but as a necessity. Dependence that had been abstract became immediate, with political implications that extended far beyond the battlefield. Politically, the war triggered a rupture. Trust between leadership and society fractured under the weight of surprise and loss. The question was no longer whether Israel had survived, but whether its decision-making culture had failed. Accountability became unavoidable. Investigations followed. Careers ended. Institutions were forced to confront the possibility that their greatest strength, confidence born of victory, had turned into systemic vulnerability. The psychological cost was deeper and more lasting. The belief that deterrence had reshaped the region permanently was gone. In its place emerged a harsher understanding that deterrence must be constantly renegotiated, not assumed. The war introduced doubt into every future assessment. That doubt improved caution, but it also embedded anxiety. Strategic clarity was replaced by strategic vigilance, a far more exhausting state. For Egypt and Syria, the outcome was equally complex. Militarily, they did not achieve decisive victory. But strategically, they accomplished something that had eluded them for years: they broke the narrative of Israeli inevitability. That alone altered diplomatic terrain. Negotiations that once seemed unreachable became possible. The war's value, from their perspective, lay not in territory held at the end, but in perception changed at the beginning. Yet this success also carried a price. Losses were severe. Forces were pushed beyond their original protective concepts. Once Israeli counteraction intensified, vulnerabilities became costly. The very decision to push further than planned, driven by early success, exposed units to retaliation they were not designed to absorb. Strategic restraint, once abandoned, could not be easily reimposed. There is a temptation to frame the war as a lesson cleanly learned. Israel corrected its assumptions. The Arab states proved a point. Balance was restored. This framing is comforting and incomplete. The deeper truth is that no side emerged without damage that reshaped future behavior. Israel became more cautious, more suspicious, and more willing to act early. The Arab states became more aware of the limits of limited war. The most important cost, however, is abstract. It is the cost of discovering the limits of a system under real conditions. Israel learned that warning is not a guarantee, doctrine is not protection, and restraint is not always stability. These lessons could only be learned through failure, and failure demanded payment in lives. This is why the Yom Kippur War cannot be reduced to a story of recovery. Recovery is what happens after loss. The loss itself remains part of the system's memory. Every future decision carries the imprint of those early hours, shaping thresholds, reactions, and fears. The war did not end Israel's strategic strength. It ended its strategic innocence. And that transformation, irreversible, expensive, and incomplete, is the true outcome of the conflict. And once the price is fully counted, the final question remains: what does this war actually teach about strategy itself, beyond this battlefield and this moment? The Yom Kippur War is often remembered as a correction. A shock that forced Israel to adapt, reform, and ultimately restore balance. That reading is incomplete. This war does not primarily teach how systems recover. It teaches how systems fail before they collapse, and why that failure is often invisible to those inside it. At its core, this war is not about surprise. Surprise is an outcome. The deeper issue is assumption. Israel did not miscalculate enemy strength. It misjudged enemy intent, and more importantly, misjudged how intent can evolve when conventional victory is impossible. Strategy failed not because information was absent, but because interpretation was constrained. The first lesson is that victory rewrites risk perception faster than it rewrites reality. After 1967, Israel's success compressed uncertainty. Ambiguity was no longer treated as dangerous, it was treated as manageable. This is a subtle but fatal shift. When uncertainty becomes familiar, it stops triggering defensive reflexes. The system learns to live with warning signs instead of acting on them. In 1973, Israel did not ignore signals. It normalized them. The second lesson is that doctrine ages even when it remains internally coherent. Israel's doctrine was not irrational. It was consistent, disciplined, and rooted in experience. What it failed to do was evolve its definition of success and failure. Doctrine assumed that war would only be initiated if the enemy believed it could win decisively. When the enemy abandoned that goal, doctrine lost its predictive power. Strategy that cannot imagine partial success by the adversary will always be surprised by it. The third lesson concerns restraint. Restraint is usually framed as wisdom. In this case, restraint became inertia. The decision not to mobilize early was not cowardly. It was cautious in isolation. But strategy is not judged in isolation. When restraint is repeated under changing conditions, it transforms from prudence into exposure. The war demonstrates that restraint must be actively recalibrated. Otherwise, it hardens into a habit that benefits the opponent. Another critical insight lies in how systems treat dissent. Israel's failure was not the absence of critical voices, but their inability to shift outcomes. Systems built on past success tend to reward conformity disguised as professionalism. Warnings that challenge the prevailing narrative are filtered not because they are wrong, but because they are disruptive. The Yom Kippur War shows how strategic failure can occur even when individuals act rationally within their roles. The problem is not bad actors. It is good actors trapped in a rigid structure. This war also reframes the meaning of deterrence. Deterrence is often understood as preventing action. In reality, it shapes how action is taken. Egypt and Syria were deterred from fighting a decisive war. They were not deterred from fighting a limited one. By focusing on preventing the worst-case scenario, Israel left itself vulnerable to a different, subtler threat. Deterrence that does not account for adaptation is incomplete by definition. Perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson is about time. Israel built its strategy around controlling time, through warning, mobilization, and rapid escalation. The Arab strategy targeted time directly, not forces. They compressed it, distorted it, and consumed it. Once time was lost, every Israeli advantage became conditional. This reveals a broader principle: in modern conflict, time is not a neutral resource. It is contested terrain. The war also exposes the danger of equating intelligence with certainty. Information without interpretive flexibility is not power. It is noise filtered through belief. Israel's intelligence system was active, sophisticated, and engaged. What it lacked was permission to challenge the foundational assumptions of the state's security logic. Strategy fails when intelligence serves doctrine, rather than interrogating it. There is no clean moral to extract from this conflict. The Yom Kippur War does not argue for constant preemption, nor does it argue for permanent restraint. It argues for something more difficult: continuous doubt. Not paralyzing doubt, but structured skepticism toward one's own success. Systems must be designed not only to detect enemy action, but to detect their own complacency. This is why the war remains strategically relevant. It is not tied to a specific technology, geography, or political era. It is a case study in how institutions mistake stability for permanence, and how enemies exploit that mistake without needing superiority. Any organization, military or otherwise, that believes its past victories define future behavior is vulnerable in the same way. The final truth of the Yom Kippur War is not that Israel was surprised. It is that Israel had come to believe surprise was no longer possible. That belief shaped every decision, every delay, and every cost that followed. Once that belief collapsed, recovery was inevitable. But the price of collapse could not be refunded. Strategy, in the end, is not about choosing the smartest option. It is about choosing under uncertainty without letting past success decide what uncertainty looks like. And that is why this war does not belong to history alone. It belongs to every system that believes it has already learned its most dangerous lesson. The Yom Kippur War ends without a clean moral victory for anyone involved. Israel survives, but something fundamental is lost. Egypt and Syria regain leverage, but not resolution. The battlefield settles, the lines shift, diplomacy resumes. And yet the most important outcome is invisible on any map. What truly changed in October 1973 was not territory. It was certainty. Israel entered the war believing that its security system had removed the possibility of strategic shock. It exited the war knowing that no system, no matter how sophisticated, can eliminate surprise, only relocate it. From that point forward, Israeli strategy would no longer be built on confidence alone, but on suspicion of its own assumptions. That shift improved survivability, but it also imposed a permanent psychological cost. Every warning would now be louder. Every silence more dangerous. For the Arab states, the war proved something equally unsettling. Limited success could reshape the strategic environment, but it could not be sustained indefinitely. Breaking deterrence was possible. Replacing it with stability was not guaranteed. The war opened doors, but it also revealed the limits of controlled escalation. Once surprise is spent, power reasserts itself. The deeper lesson of this conflict is not about Israel, Egypt, or Syria as unique cases. It is about how systems behave when success becomes identity. When doctrine stops being a tool and becomes a belief. When caution is rewarded until it becomes inertia. When intelligence informs decisions, but cannot challenge the framework that gives those decisions meaning. the Yom Kippur War reminds us that strategy does not fail loudly. It fails quietly, through habits that once worked, assumptions that once protected, and confidence that once saved lives. By the time failure is undeniable, the price has already been paid. This is why the war remains relevant far beyond its era. Any institution, military, political, or organizational, that believes it has mastered its environment is standing on unstable ground. The most dangerous enemy is not the one you underestimate. It is the one you believe no longer needs to be imagined. The file on the Yom Kippur War can be closed. The question it raises cannot. Because the moment a system believes surprise is impossible, it has already decided how it will be surprised next.